My blood and the blood of my victims must be on the heads of my torturers. The punishments I have suffered have destroyed all my feelings as a human being. That was why I had no pity for my victims. Looking back at the criminal history of the world, there are not many serial killers who can be called vampires, and even fewer who are truly notorious. Andrei Chikatilo, who was active from the 1980s to 1990s, killed 52 people during his criminal career and drank the blood of one of his victims. Richard Chase from the US, a mentally deranged drunkard and drug user, believed that drinking blood could cure his illness. So, after committing his crimes, he would slit the throats or blood vessels of his victims, collect their blood in containers, and drink it. In addition to Andre and Chase, there was another vampire in the early 20th century whose modus operandi was both brutal and cold-blooded. His name was Peter Kürten. Over the course of 17 years, he murdered at least 9 victims and was involved in several attempted murders. Moreover, after the crime scenes were discovered, he would return to the locations, discuss the details of the cases with the police as an ordinary citizen. Peter's childhood, like that of many notorious serial killers in history, was filled with intractable hardships and problems. On May 26, 1883, he was born into a poor, abusive family in Mulheim am Rhine. Peter was the eldest of 13 children in the family, and 2 of whom unfortunately died at birth. However, perhaps living in such a family, premature death was also a kind of relief. Peter's father was an alcoholic who lived with his wife and more than a dozen children in a tiny one-bedroom apartment where living space was extremely cramped. Yet, even in such a chaotic and extremely crowded environment, this brutal man acted like a dictator. He drank excessively and, after drinking, would quarrel with his wife and beat her and the children present. He would even force the 11 children to watch him have sex with their mother. As time passed, 9-year-old Peter became acquainted with a dog catcher, a degenerate man who taught Peter how to satisfy his sexual desires with his hands and encouraged him to engage in bestiality with dogs. Growing up in a family environment filled with twisted sexual behavior, Peter had already witnessed his parents having sex multiple times from a young age. However, due to his age, he did not fully understand the implications of what the man was trying to tell. Entering adolescence, Peter grew increasingly disgusted with his painful and twisted family. He started skipping school, running away from home, immersing himself in the chaotic streets. During this period, influenced by puberty, Peter's desire for sexual activity gradually increased, especially after being exposed to his parents' sexual behavior from a young age. He met a girl his age who allowed him to hold her hand, kiss her, and even touch her body, but she firmly resisted any further sexual advances from Peter. In order to relieve his sexual urges, Peter recalled the dog catcher's words and began to sneak into local farms and stables to engage in bestiality with dogs, sheep, pigs, and goats. In the process, he also exhibited his violent tendencies, stabbing and cutting the animals with a knife. Later, Peter claimed that he had to stab the animals with a knife before reaching sexual climax in order to achieve the so-called maximum pleasure. When asked about his family environment, Peter said this: "The whole family suffered through his drinking. For when he was in drink, my father was terrible. As you may well imagine, we suffered terrible poverty, all because the wages went on drink. We all lived in one room, and you will appreciate what affect that had on me sexually." In 1897, before running away from home, Peter took all the money he could find in the house. Shortly after he left, his father, the brutal man, was arrested and sentenced to 18 months in prison for repeatedly raping his own 13-year-old daughter. After running away, Peter moved to Koblenz. There, he was frequently brought to court for petty theft and was sentenced to prison multiple times. During his initial prison sentence, he claimed he was frequently subjected to severe punishment, abuse, and beatings, and those painful experiences gradually warped his mind. In order to escape the agony, he developed intense erotic fantasies. In the first year of the 20th century, Peter was arrested for fraud and sentenced to 4 years in prison, where he was incarcerated in Düsseldorf. In the summer of 1904, after Peter was released from prison, he was conscripted into the Imperial German Army. However, he soon deserted and became a fugitive. This was because, during his service, he had committed multiple acts of arson, setting fire to several barns and haylofts. Later, Peter claimed that he had two reasons for the arson. The first was to satisfy his sexual excitement, and the second was his desire to burn the sleeping vagrants alive. In 1905, Peter was tried by a military court for desertion. He was charged with multiple counts of robbery and over 20 counts of arson, and was sentenced to 8 years of solitary confinement. After being arrested for murder later on, Peter told investigators and psychologists that this period of imprisonment was the first time he had experienced such strict supervision and control. In prison, under the high-pressure environment, Peter's erotic fantasies gradually expanded in his mind to include vivid fantasies of revenge against society and acts of killing, and over time these fantasies became increasingly intense, and he derived a twisted pleasure from them. On May 25, 1913, Peter, after being released from prison, sneaked into a house in Mulheim in Rhine with the intention of committing robbery. At that time, a 10-year-old girl named Christine was fast asleep in her bed in the upstairs bedroom. By then, Peter's twisted fantasies had already affected his mind, so, upon seeing the girl, he forgot his initial goal. The next day, Peter went to a bar near the house. Local residents were discussing a recently occurred rape and murder case, with the victim being the 10-year-old Christine. She had been sexually assaulted and brutally stabbed to death. However, the focus of their discussion was not her death. In reality, Christine was not the only one in the house at that time. In that area, many residents converted the ground floor of their houses into bars or inns. Christine's parents were actually worked in the bar located downstairs from her bedroom. And the only people who could access the second floor were Christine, her parents, and her uncle. So neither the police nor Christine's parents realized that the killer might be a stranger. Instead, they suspected Christine's uncle. In the end, Christine's uncle was wrongfully imprisoned, while the real killer, Peter, frequently visited Christine's grave in the following weeks, masturbating while looking at her tombstone. 2 months later, Peter broke into another house, where he found a 17-year-old girl was sleeping. He strangled her until she was unconscious and achieved sexual climax while she was barely alive, but in the end, he did not kill her, just left the scene. At the time, no one knew why Peter spared her. The truth only came to light after his arrest. On July 14th, Peter was arrested for a series of arson and theft offenses and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. His sentence was later extended by 2 years due to his repeated refusal to obey prison rules during his incarceration. In April 1921, after being released, Peter moved to Altenburg. Initially, he lived with his sister. Later, through her introduction, he met August, a woman 3 years his senior. August ran a candy store and had a troubled past. She had once been a prostitute and had served time in prison for shooting her fiancé. However, August was unaware that Peter also had an even more horrifying history. Peter later revealed to others he only felt the desire for sex when fantasizing about inflicting violence on another person. For example, after their wedding night, he would only have sex with August when she wanted it. From 1921 to 1925, during the 4 years, Peter led a relatively normal life. He became a mold maker and actively participated in trade union activities. However, in 1925, when he and August went to Düsseldorf, the peaceful life was shattered. There, Peter had affairs with a maid named Tiede and a servant girl named Mek. When August discovered his infidelity, Tiede reported Peter to the police, claiming that he had seduced her. Mek, on the other hand, claimed that Peter had raped her. In the end, although the serious rape charge was dropped, Peter was still sentenced to 8 months in prison for seduction and threats. After serving 6 months, Peter was granted the opportunity for early release, but he had to leave Düsseldorf. As time moved to 1929, this year in Düsseldorf, Peter committed a series of assault cases. On February 3rd, he targeted a middle-aged woman. Standing next to some bushes, he was dressed in a neat suit with his hair neatly parted, looking like a proper businessman. In a calm tone, he motioned for her to come closer. Though the woman had no idea what was happening, she approached. However, as soon as she was concealed by the bushes, Peter suddenly pushed her to the ground, clutching tightly at the collar of her coat and shouting, "Don't make a sound, don't scream." Then he took out a pair of sharp scissors and stabbed her 24 times. Fortunately, despite the multiple stab wounds, the woman survived because none of the scissors thrusts had pierced any vital organs. On February 8th, Peter strangled a 9-year-old girl named Rosa until she lost consciousness, and then brutally stabbed her abdomen, temples, genitals, and heart with scissors. He then doused Rosa's body with a bottle of kerosene and set it on fire. Watching the child's body char as it burned, he experienced sexual climax. 5 days later, Peter traveled to the northern suburbs of the Flinchen district in Düsseldorf, where he murdered a 45-year-old mechanic named Rudolf. He stabbed Rudolf 20 times with scissors, particularly targeting the head, back, and eyes. When Rudolf's body was discovered, Peter, he nonchalantly returned to the crime scene, dressed in a neat suit, and conversed with the police investigating the case. Despite the stark differences in age and gender among the 3 victims, all 3 crimes took place in the same area, occurred around dusk, involved repeated stabbing, and lacked any apparent motive of robbery or other criminal intent. These numerous similarities led local investigators to conclude that the 3 cases were most likely committed by the same person, and the victims appeared to have been chosen at random. From March to July, although Peter claimed that he attempted to strangle 4 women, and one of whom he threw into the Rhine River, he did not kill any other known victims before August 11th. On August 8th, Peter met a woman named Han, whom he described as a girl eager for marriage. He then made an arrangement with her to take her on a date on the 11th. That day, Peter and Han had a pleasant outing. After spending a few hours together, he lured Han to an isolated meadow. He later claimed that at that spot, Han pleaded with him to spare her life, but he simply sat on her, strangled her with his hands, and stabbed her chest and head with scissors until she died. 3 weeks later, Peter returned to the cornfield where he had buried Han. He planned to dig up her decaying corpse and nail it to a tree, staging a fake crucifixion to shock and disgust the public. However, Han's body was too heavy for him to carry out this idea, so he simply dug up her corpse, lay beside her, and embraced and caressed the decaying body. He later said, "I felt very satisfied every time I thought about what was lying there." 3 months after murdering Han, perhaps out of boredom, Peter sent an anonymous letter to the police. He admitted to killing Han and mentioned that her body was buried in a cornfield. The letter included a crude map indicating the location of the body. In the end, investigators found Han's body on November 15th, following the directions in the letter. Several days after the murder of Han, in an attempt to mislead the police, Peter switched his weapon of choice from scissors to a knife. In the early hours of August 21st, he carried out 3 random attacks. The victims were an 18-year-old girl, a 30-year-old man, and a 37-year-old woman. Fortunately, none of them died. On August 24th, Peter, he stood at the entrance of an amusement park and saw a 5-year-old girl and a 14-year-old girl walking out. He followed them through several streets to a vegetable field near the girl's home. Then, Peter stopped them. He took out some money and handed it to the 14-year-old girl Louise, asking her to buy cigarettes for him. Once Louise left, Peter was alone with the 5-year-old girl, Gertrude. It was clear that Peter's moment to commit a crime had arrived. He first strangled Gertrude and then took out his knife, slashing her throat, and left her body in a field planted with beans. When Louise returned to the scene, before she could ask where her sister was, Peter killed her. But even Louise was dead. Peter did not stop. He immediately placed his mouth over Louise's wound and drank her blood. A day later, Peter, he approached a 27-year-old maid named Schultz and brazenly asked her for sex. Despite his neat appearance, Schultz flatly refused due to his rude manner of speaking. After being rejected, Peter repeatedly stabbed Schultz in the head, neck, and back with a knife. Fortunately, Schultz did not die and survived the attack. However, despite having interacted with Peter, she was unable to describe his appearance in detail due to the pain and shock. She only managed to say that the attacker was around 40 years old. In September, Peter changed his weapon again, this time switching from a knife to a hammer. On the evening of September 30th, he met a 31-year-old maid named Liet at the train station. He successfully persuaded her to accompany him to a cafe and then take a walk along the Rhine River. There, he took out the hammer and attacked Liet, knocking her unconscious. Peter did not kill her, but merely sexually assaulted her before leaving the scene. On October 11th, he encountered a 22-year-old maid named Elizabeth outside a theater. Her situation was similar to that of Leeti, but unfortunately she died from severe injuries after being struck on the head and both temples with the hammer. On October 25th, Peter attacked 2 more women with a hammer, and both of them survived. On November 7th, Peter encountered 5-year-old Alberman on a street in Düsseldorf. He coaxed the child into accompanying him to an abandoned vegetable field. There, he grabbed her by the throat and, following his usual modus operandi, stabbed her head with scissors. As Alberman fell to the ground, he continued to stab her head and chest 34 more times. In those days, these cases had already attracted immense public attention due to their extreme brutality and the diverse backgrounds of the victims, as well as the varying methods of assault and murder. Initially, both the public and the local police believed that the crimes were committed by multiple individuals rather than a single person. By the end of 1929, the Düsseldorf police had a list of 900,000 different names of suspects. Over 9,000 people had been questioned, and the public had sent them more than 13,000 letters. Just 2 days after Alberman's murder, a local newspaper received a letter. It detailed the location of Han's grave and precisely indicated where Alberman's body was buried, stating that her corpse was concealed beneath a pile of bricks and rubble. Later, through handwriting analysis, a graphologist concluded that the letters about Han and Alberman were written by the same person. This conclusion led Ernst, the chief inspector from the Berlin Police Department, to determine that the series of attacks were likely carried out by a single individual. In addition, the murder of Alberman was Peter's last fatal attack. Although he carried out a series of hammer attacks and strangulations from February to May 1930, injuring 10 victims, all of them survived and were able to describe his appearance to the police. At this point, his identity was about to be revealed. His criminal career was also nearing its end. On May 14, 1930, a man approached a 20-year-old woman named Maria at the Düsseldorf train station. After learning that Maria was looking for temporary accommodation and work, he offered to take her to a hostel. Maria, unsuspecting, agreed to his suggestion. However, as they walked, Maria sensed something was amiss because the direction they were heading became increasingly remote with hardly any pedestrians. So, she argued with him. As they were arguing, a man dressed in a neat suit with neatly parted hair walked over. It was Peter. He asked Maria if she had been harassed by the man. Seeing Peter approaching, the man walked away directly. Then, Peter invited Maria to his apartment to rest for a while. Obviously, Maria, who had just been deceived, immediately realized Peter's motive. She clearly stated that she was not interested in him and would not have sex with him. Hearing this, Peter nodded calmly. Instead of arguing, he directly took control of Maria, took her into a small grove of trees, and attempted to sexually assault her. During this time, Maria kept screaming loudly. Perhaps because Peter did not bring his tools for the crime, he could not kill Maria immediately, so he let her go. After surviving the attack, Maria did not report it to the police. As a newcomer to Düsseldorf, she was unaware of the series of attacks that had occurred in the area. She only mentioned the incident in a letter to a friend. On May 19th, an employee at the local post office opened a letter because the address was incorrect. However, this letter was the one Maria had sent to her friend. Sensing something was amiss, the employee forwarded the letter to the Düsseldorf police. Not long after, the letter was sent to Ernst, the chief inspector of the Berlin Police Department. After carefully reading the content of the letter, he concluded that the person who attacked Maria was very likely the same one responsible for the multiple crimes. Although the slim chances, he located Maria and inquired about the detailed events of that day. In the meantime, Peter confessed his criminal career to his wife and urged her to claim the substantial reward offered by the police for his capture. The next day, after a night of contemplation, August went to the police station, told the investigators that her husband Peter was the killer of the series of murders and attempted murders. That afternoon, Peter was arrested. Upon entering the interrogation room, he unreservedly admitted to his crimes, including 9 murders and 31 attempted murders. He made no attempt to make excuses, but instead recounted his life, using the injustices he had suffered to justify his actions. He also stated that he had drunk blood from the throats of some victims, from the heads of others, and licked blood from the hands of yet another. For example, after killing Han, he drank so much blood from the wound on her neck that he vomited. This is why Peter became known as the Vampire of Düsseldorf. When discussing the weapons he used in his attacks, he emphasized that although he changed his methods and tools to mislead investigators into believing they were looking for more than one killer, the weapons he used were irrelevant to his goal of seeing the victims bleed. He said, whether it was a knife, scissors, or a hammer that made him see the blood, it didn't matter to him. He also admitted that many victims survived not because they were lucky, but because he achieved sexual climax early in the attacks and no longer needed the blood for stimulation. During the interrogation, he stated that the primary motive behind all his criminal activities was to retaliate against an oppressive society. He felt that his multiple imprisonments throughout his life were unjust, and his crimes were also a form of revenge for the neglect and abuse he suffered in his childhood. In the end, numerous psychologists concluded that Peter was not a madman and that there was nothing wrong with his mental state. He was deemed a sane individual capable of standing trial. On April 13, 1931, the trial began. Peter was charged with 9 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. When asked if he felt any pangs of conscience for his actions, he replied, "I have none. Never have I felt any misgiving in my soul. Never did I think to myself that what I did was bad, even though human society condemns it. My blood and the blood of my victims must be on the heads of my torturers. The punishments I have suffered have destroyed all my feelings as a human being. That was why I had no pity for my victims." The trial lasted 10 days. On April 22nd, the jury reached a verdict in less than 2 hours. Peter was found guilty and sentenced to death for the 9 murders. He was also found guilty of the 7 attempted murders. When the judge pronounced the sentence, Peter showed no emotion. In his final statement to the court, he said that he now considered his crimes so terrible that he did not want to make any excuses for them. Later, Peter did not appeal his conviction. Instead, he requested to see his confessor, wanting to write letters of apology to the victims' relatives and a final farewell letter to his wife. On the evening of July 1st, 1931, he had his last meal, a Wiener Schnitzel, a bottle of white wine, and fried potatoes. At 6 o'clock in the morning on July 2nd, he was executed by guillotine in the prison in Cologne. Before his execution, his last words were, "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." Even in his final moments, Peter still exhibited a twisted fascination with violence and bloodshed, fantasizing about hearing his own blood gushing out even as he faced death.